I've tried to beat Kingdom Come Deliverance 4 times already. Before starting this most recent playthrough, I probably had around 120 hours in it, without ever seeing the end screen. I rented it from Family Video when it came out in 2018. I think I was on the Xbox at that point, and after playing through the introduction for an hour, I ran into a game-breaking bug. When escaping from the beginning combat scene, an enemy would spawn directly in front of me and one-shot me just after the loading screen. Then I grabbed it on a Steam sale a few years later. The bug was fixed, but 80 hours in something came up and I never finished it. Until I stumbled across a dirt cheap copy for the PS4, another 30 or so hours into the story, and, well, I didn't finish it again. So here I am, at last, taking one more stab at Kingdom Come Deliverance before the sequel officially launches. It's a first-person game juggling a lot of tabletop RPG elements, with some immersive sim and dueling combat mechanics. Despite that initial bug, I did generally have fond memories of this one. It's one of those precious few games I have intentionally brought up in a face-to-face, real-life conversation with a human person. There's a lot of incredible systems at play, some wonderfully complex mechanics, and the keen attention to historical detail is still pretty much unrivaled. The plot itself is largely historical fiction, although the broad history is accurate. It sort of morphs some real people into loosely related characters, and some geographic concessions were made for playability's sake. This review will touch on the game's plot to some degree, so consider this your spoiler warning. I did start this game up solely with the intention of actually finishing it this time. If you've been gaming for a while, you probably have a decent idea of what this might mean. Sticking solely to the main path, finding little workarounds for complicated quests, that sort of thing. With a game I've already put over 100 hours in, well, I'm a lot less likely to try to take my time. I already have, and I know how it worked out. I also decided to play on hardcore mode, which removed a lot of HUD elements and generally made things more difficult. One of the more interesting adjustments is hiding compass markers, removing fast travel, and not indicating the player's position on the map. I spent a lot of time lost in the woods comparing the shape of cricks. There's also some footage I recorded of normal mode gameplay as well, so you may spot those differences in the HUD. We play as Henry, a blacksmith's son, learning the trade from his father in the silver mining town of Skalitz. The year is 1403, the Holy Roman Empire is having an internal schism, and we're in Bohemia, now the Czech Republic. One of the really intriguing aspects of this game is how little you start with. A key aspect of the historical accuracy, I suppose, but at the beginning of the game, Henry is a real blank slate. He can't fight, can't read, and has never left his county. The prologue is an interesting look into day-to-day historical village life. It's a kind of medieval scene that's not really depicted elsewhere, the kind of life that most of the population would have led, and therefore has no interest to the modern counterpart. Local teens getting into fights over their father's political affiliations, young couples navigating romance in a small world, and Henry, dreaming of better things than being stuck in the village. These are people. It's rare for a game, especially a medieval game, to take into account that everyone involved with the plot is just some guy, some human, who doesn't particularly want to be dirty or to be hurt in a fight. People who know the ins and outs of their trade and their own world. Maybe they want to get through the workday and gamble, or save up enough to see the city. This is an RPG that ultimately centers around peasants, and it treats them as humans instead of symbols. And I appreciate it when stories acknowledge that our ancestors had the same humors, drives, and fears as us. Anyways, the bulk of the prologue deals with Henry and his father forging a one-of-a-kind sword for the village's lord, Sir Radzig, interrupted when a mercenary army marches on Skalitz and burns everything to the ground, murdering Henry's parents and giving Henry his main motive, retrieving the special sword and revenging himself upon the leader of the Marauders. It's a tall order for an illiterate hothead. Once the game opens up into free roam, we're dumped headfirst into the crushing gears of mechanics. The world is basically operating like a CRPG. We've got a character sheet with stats and skills that level independently through use and feed XP back to our main level. As we rank up the various skills, we can pick a selection of feats, and there are in fact wrong choices here, as a lot of these options are wildly overpowered. There's a hunger and a sleep system, of course, item durability, reputation, hunting, stealth, a very strange economy, and notably an appearance system. During conversations, there are generally 3 persuasive options we can use to get our way. Speech is tied to a skill we can level up through talking, but the other 2 options, the sword and the crown, those are tied to the physical appearance of Henry. If he shows up wearing chainmail covered in mud, he'll seem awfully threatening. But come as a courtier in fine silks, and you can convince the peasantry to do almost anything. Full plate mail strikes an interesting balance in this. If you keep it clean by washing up in bathhouses and troughs, you'll seem princely. But let it get caked in mud and blood, and suddenly you're a blackguard. It's a really novel system that's a lot more interesting than tying persuasion directly to a single stat. And it's like they say, appearances are everything. Back to that economy simulation. Every merchant starts the game with a certain amount of groschen and will buy items from us for around 50% of their value. After a few days, the merchant offloads everything they sold and collects 100% of the value. This is also a loot anything game. Every enemy we kill can be fully stripped and all their precious armor carted off to a merchant. Personally, as a weird little pack rat, I spent a lot of time, too much time actually, waddling around with an overflowing pack, fattening up those merchants' coffers. Because each merchant has a locked chest nearby that physically holds the available coin of their shop. Around halfway through my current run, I broke into the armorer I had been visiting and stole enough money to completely disregard the economy from that point on. And I didn't even try very hard. This economy breaks the moment you approach it. Now, the combat system is controversial, I think. We start off as a genuine nobody. Henry is supposed to be 17 or so, and these are his very first days of violence. In the beginning, we get our ass kicked. A lot. Henry is slow to reposition, slow to strike, easy to throw off balance, and this game has a very unique directional strike system. We share Henry's unfamiliarity with combat. It seems hopeless and frustrating at first. When we strike, an enemy might trap our sword and thwap us on the head. But eventually we're given permission to train with the captain of the guard in Rete, and once we have some training under our belt, it comes together, both as the player's actual skill navigating the system increases and Henry's mechanical skill value increases. The combat is based on directional positioning. When combat begins, we're met with a very aggressive lock-on. The mouse is used pretty solely to change the direction of the swinging posture. And there's a few tricks we can use: feinting strikes, clinches, combo attacks. We start landing more hits, and just when it feels like we understand all our options, it's made redundant by learning master strikes. Essentially, it's a Dark Souls get good parry kill button. When an enemy rears up for an attack, smash that block button and you'll riposte. It's powerful enough to take some enemies down in a single hit, and honestly the combat system really suffers for how easy it is to pull off, and often how necessary it is. Because from mid-game, enemies will be using these on you as well, all the time. There's definitely some sort of background calculation going on with every swing, comparing your character sheet to the opponent and rolling dice. That determines if an enemy will block, parry, or get hit. By the end of the game, too many of these exchanges turn into master strike trade-offs. This combat system is purpose-made for dueling a single opponent on flat terrain, and it's curious how the story almost never puts us in that position. There's one particularly notable duel against a bandit captain, but other than that, the story beat combat is small-scale mixed infantry skirmishes every time. It strains the system and the engine itself. The enemies become absolute morons once there's more than a handful of characters on the screen, hitting each other constantly, dogpiling single targets in huge swarms, running in random directions, and staying locked on to other targets even after you engage them. The army level scenes in the game are some of the most visually interesting parts, but they feel intensely unsatisfying. Outside of the main story, most engagements will be a handful of bandits fighting Henry alone. These seem tricky, but somehow every time I fell into one, it ended up becoming cheesy. The enemy would break and stand still while I shot them with arrows, or I'd backstep into a tree by accident and be flung into the air. And when it did work as intended, it felt a bit like trying to sword fight a river. Cycling to the correct enemy to pull off a block gets frustrating due to the heavy lock-on, and often enemies will sprint off screen as you backpedal. I don't know. The combat for this felt like a great idea for a different story, something more personal and focused on escalating high-stakes one-on-one duels. As is, I just kept thinking, this really isn't as good as Mountain Blade. Graphically, it's in an odd place. This game came out in 2018, the same year as Red Dead Redemption 2, and it looks, well, the faces and animations are better than Skyrim. In my head, it feels like this game came out about 4 years earlier than it actually did. The environments are based on the real geography around Skalitz, and you know what, it is beautiful. Rolling fields of wheat, thickly wooded hills, pastoral gardens. It's all very painterly. It reminds me a lot of Pennsylvania, the nice parts of it. As far as the sound design, that's uneven. There's a lot of nice ambiance, but some sound effects feel like you're hearing everything through a thin wall.
Hei, Otvan!
They also got Brian Blessed for the late-game role.
Sweep the foe from the battlements.
Roquetta? I do not believe I've heard of such a term.
Roquetta are missiles filled with black powder with a touch hole at the bottom to ignite it. They shoot forward, something like a hand cannon, but without rocks. The rocket is the missile.
I see. But we don't have black powder in these parts. Nor cannon.
Indeed. It should have occurred to me. But I am very fond of Roquetta, and I always think what Alexander the Great might have accomplished with them.
The real draw of this game, the enduring appeal, is the writing. The lore is history. It's one of the few games that has an index full of apparently well-researched historical documentation. I actually learned a ton about medieval Europe from this, information about industries I never consciously considered existing. The spoken and unspoken rules between peasants and nobility, light sources, and pre-industrial commerce. Heck, I learned the peasants didn't even need to have permits for pole fishing. Just another way the DNR is keeping us down. Being drawn into the setting and soaking in all the small details is where this game really shines. I missed that a little on this playthrough, rushing through as I was. But there's a lot of great character work here, specifically the arc with Lord Capon, or the DLC that has us step into the shoes of a peasant woman. The main story plot seems to alternate between the two primary gameplay systems. After the prologue ends, Henry is allowed into Lord Radzig's retinue, and takes on a role as an investigator assigned to root out the massive wave of banditry in the countryside. So the missions veer into CSI Bohemia, questioning witnesses, examining bodies, following tracks, and then these investigations culminate in siege battles. There's one particularly notable sequence where Henry goes undercover in a monastery. This part is where the game's intense characterization shines, as we question the novices and realize most of them don't particularly care about becoming monks. For some, they're the non-inheritor sons of nobility, locked away to prevent future claims, and others, criminals under assumed identities trying to escape the law. A lesser game, a lesser story, would have all these novices as intensely faithful, all here for the same purpose, would leave them as shallow archetypes. I'll say it again. Kingdom Come Deliverance's biggest strength is portraying the people of the past not as dim-witted savages, but as living people. The biggest problem with this game is that the back half really drags on and somehow fails to resolve most everything. The last 6 or so hours of story missions are back and forth sieges. First an enemy encampment, and then a castle that the enemy took over while we weren't looking. It's really cool to see these small-scale infantry skirmishes, since games usually shy away from that in favor of massive armies or individual combat. But as I said before, The bots struggle when they're fighting in force, and it becomes a bit of a slog. The other kind of weird and unique thing about this game is the focus on simple logistics. Delivering messages on horseback, tracking down a source of pitch, feeding the troops, finding an engineer who actually has experience building siege engines, the kind of details taken for granted in other games. The kind of humdrum arranging that puts siege battles into context. They were, after all, battles of attrition and supply line organization, with actual wall scaling only happening as a last resort. After we siege and retake the town, the villain scarpers off with his lover, and the game sort of ends. Henry doesn't retake the family sword, nor does he get revenge. I'm glad to have finally seen the ending, but it's barely an ending. More of a mid-season cliffhanger. Then there's an epilogue. Especially with the removal of fast travel, I was pretty tired of the hardcore mode by the point the epilogue rolled in, and it genuinely upset me that the end screen is now locked behind an additional 3-hour DLC mission. The DLC did have some good moments though, so I forgive it in hindsight. Also, it turns out that I gave up on my first playthrough on the very last mission. I would not have expected that. On the trusty pain scale, I would give Kingdom Come Deliverance a moderately painful. It's one of the most ambitiously researched games I've ever played. It's mechanically deep, and the unique combat system is a brief joy to master and then hollow. There's rough parts, there's bugs, there's some wildly imbalanced strategies. But the characters and the setting are so richly developed. It's truly a unique RPG. I've abandoned it so many times, but there's something that keeps bringing me back again and again. And yet there's also something that keeps me from finishing it again and again. Well, that's all for my 30-second review. The winter is in full force here, and we're getting down to single digits Fahrenheit. I've been off and on sick for a few weeks, and it's all pretty miserable. But spring is coming soon. Thanks for tuning in. See ya!